Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at a recent study from Germany's IFO Institute. It was commissioned by the Chamber of Commerce for Munich and Upper Bavaria. They took a really interesting look at the economic drag created by excessive regulation. I've got an expert here to break it all down with me.
This study really tries to put some numbers around the impact of all this regulation. It's one thing to say, oh, paperwork is a pain, but this gets into how it actually affects a country's economic output.
One of the first things that caught my eye was this term, Erfüllungsaufwand. It's basically German for fulfillment cost. Can you tell us what that means in the context of this study?
Sure. Erfüllungsaufwand refers to the actual costs that companies have to bear when they're trying to comply with all the laws and regulations out there. It's not just the obvious stuff like, the paper for the forms and paying someone to handle it. It also includes the time that employees have to spend on all those compliance tasks. And what they found is that this cost has actually been going up in Germany, especially since 2021.
And that's just what we can see on the surface, right?
Mm-hmm.
The study then goes on to look at what they call the hidden costs of all this bureaucracy. Can you give us some examples of these kind of less obvious economic consequences?
Well, one of the big ones is that companies might just decide it's not worth it and leave the market entirely. That obviously hurts competition and can stifle innovation. The study also shows how excessive bureaucracy can make companies think twice about investing. And of course, it can make it really tough for new businesses to even get off the ground. It basically creates an environment where businesses are spending more time jumping through hoops than actually, doing business and growing the economy.
They use a really interesting method in this study to try and isolate the impact of reforming these bureaucratic systems. They look for what they call bureaucracy reduction spikes. These are moments when countries made a big effort to cut down on all the red tape. How did they find these spikes, and why are they so important to the study?
They use data from the World Bank's Doing Business report. This report looks at how easy it is to do business in different countries. They specifically looked for times when a country's bureaucracy index had a sudden and significant drop.
Yeah.
And often they found that these spikes happened because governments made a real push to make things easier for businesses. One example is France's RGPP initiative back in 2006. They basically wanted to modernize and simplify how their government worked.
Got it. And so by looking at these spikes, they were able to compare the economic performance of countries that went through these big reforms to those that didn't. What did they find?
What they found is that the countries that really made an effort to cut down on bureaucracy saw an average increase of 4.6% in real GDP per capita over time. It's important to note, though, that this wasn't an overnight thing. It took a few years for the full impact to be felt. This really highlights that bureaucratic reform isn't about quick fixes. It's a long-term investment.
That's really interesting. It suggests that these changes aren't just about putting a Band-Aid on the problem. They're about creating a more sustainable and dynamic economic environment. But how does all of this apply to Germany specifically? The study looked at what would happen if Germany made a similar effort to reform its bureaucracy. What did they find?
The results were pretty significant. They estimated that if Germany had made a similar reduction in its bureaucratic burden back in 2015, their GDP per capita would be 2,449 euros higher today. That translates to a whopping 146 billion euros of lost economic output every year. And get this, that's actually more than double what they estimate it costs to actually comply with all the regulations.
Those numbers are pretty eye-opening. It really underscores how much potential economic benefit there could be if Germany streamlined its bureaucracy. One thing this study points to is that digitalization could play a big part in mitigating the negative effects of bureaucracy. Can you talk about how digitalizing things can make it easier for businesses to deal with all this administrative burden?
It's important to remember that digitalization isn't a magic bullet, but it can definitely be a powerful tool for making these bureaucratic processes simpler and more efficient. What the study found is that countries that really embrace e-government saw their real GDP per capita go up by 2.7%. And that was even when the overall level of bureaucracy stayed the same. This suggests that going digital can help unlock economic potential by making government services more efficient and easier to access.
It sounds like that digitalization is especially helpful in places where there's already a lot of bureaucracy to begin with.
Exactly. The study found that the positive effects of digitalization were even more pronounced in those countries. It makes sense. The more complicated and cumbersome the system is, the more room there is for improvement through digitization.
So suddenly going digital could really change the game when it comes to reducing the economic drag caused by bureaucracy. But is it enough on its own? The study argues that we need a two-pronged approach to really get the full benefits of a streamlined bureaucracy. What are the two main parts of that approach?
The first part is that we need to completely overhaul and simplify the bureaucratic processes themselves. This means cutting down on the number of regulations, streamlining the ones that are left, and making the whole system easier for businesses to navigate. The second part is that we need to go all in on digitizing the essential procedures that are left. That means making sure government services are fully online, easy to use, and efficient.
So it's not just about doing less, it's also about making what we do have to do easier.
Exactly. It's about creating a lean and agile bureaucratic system that uses technology to its full potential.
And the study points out that all of this is especially important given things like demographic trends and labor shortages that many countries are facing. Why is that?
As workforces shrink, it becomes even more crucial to make sure that people's skills and talents are being used in the most productive ways possible. Bureaucracy can really tie up valuable human resources and tasks that aren't contributing to economic growth and competitiveness.
So it's not just about making life easier for businesses, it's about creating a more efficient and dynamic economy overall that can adapt to the challenges we're facing globally.
Precisely. Reducing bureaucracy is an investment in a country's future. It's about creating an environment where innovation, entrepreneurship, and economic growth can flourish. This study really emphasizes that we need to change how we think about bureaucracy. Instead of just seeing it as a cost-cutting measure, we need to see it as a strategic investment in a nation's economic future.
So the idea is that if governments make it easier for businesses to operate, they can actually boost economic growth, innovation, and job creation.
Exactly. And the study actually tries to put some numbers around this. They calculated what they call the lost economic output that Germany has experienced because it hasn't implemented substantial bureaucratic reforms.
So they're basically saying, look, here's what Germany could have achieved if they had tackled this problem.
Right. They even give a specific example. They estimate that if Germany had reduced its bureaucratic burden to the same level as Sweden back in 2015, their GDP per capita would be much higher today.
That's a pretty powerful way to illustrate the economic consequences of excessive bureaucracy.
It is. It makes it much more real and shows the potential gains that could be achieved if governments took action.
The study also stresses that reforming these systems is a long-term project.
Absolutely. It requires a sustained effort and a commitment to constantly improving.
So it's not just about making a few quick changes and calling it a day.
No, it's about creating a culture of efficiency and simplification within government. It's about always reviewing regulations, streamlining processes, and embracing digital solutions.
This makes me wonder about best practices and success stories that other governments can learn from.
That's a great point. The study actually highlights several countries that have successfully implemented these kinds of reforms. One example is France's RGPP reform program.
Can you tell us a little more about that program and what made it so successful?
Sure. RGPP stands for General Review of Public Policies. It was a really comprehensive initiative that was launched in France back in 2007 under President Nicolas Sarkozy. The main goal was to modernize and streamline the entire French public administration.
What were some of the specific measures that were part of the program?
Well, they did a lot of things. They reduced the number of civil servants, simplified administrative procedures, and introduced performance-based management. They also put a big emphasis on digitalization. They made significant investments in e-government initiatives to make it easier for citizens and businesses to interact with the government online.
And did these reforms have a noticeable impact on France's economy?
According to the study, yes, they did. France saw a substantial drop in its bureaucracy index, and its GDP per capita went up in the years after they implemented RGPP.
So that's a concrete example of how streamlining bureaucracy can lead to real economic benefits.
It is, but the study also warns against thinking that digitalization is a cure-all.
So it's not just about slapping some technology on top of existing problems.
Right. While digitalization can make things more efficient and user-friendly, it can't replace the need for fundamental reform.
So it's about using technology strategically to enhance the simplification of these processes rather than just digitizing inefficient ones.
Exactly. The goal is to create a truly digital government that is designed to meet the needs of citizens and businesses.
Are there any specific examples of how digitalization can be used effectively to reduce this bureaucratic burden?
The study mentions a few. Things like introducing electronic signatures, online tax filing, and digital building permits.
Those are all things that could save businesses and individuals a lot of time and effort.
They could also reduce the potential for errors and delays. Digitalization also allows governments to use data to figure out where processes can be further streamlined. By analyzing how people interact with government agencies, policymakers can identify bottlenecks and areas for improvement.
It sounds like data could be a really powerful tool in this effort.
It could. The study also emphasizes how important it is for governments to collaborate and share knowledge when they're implementing these
That
reforms.
makes a lot of sense.
Sharing best practices and lessons learned can help everyone make progress faster towards creating more efficient and citizen-centric administrations.
It's like the old saying, there's no need to reinvent the wheel.
Exactly. Working together allows countries to learn from each other's successes and challenges. That way, they can develop more effective strategies for reducing bureaucracy.
This deep dive has really given us a lot to think about. We've learned about the economic consequences of bureaucracy, the role that governments can play in reform, and even what we can do as individuals.
It's a complex issue, that's for sure. But the study makes a strong case for taking action. Reducing bureaucracy isn't just about cutting red tape.
It's about investing in a more prosperous and sustainable future. It's about creating a more dynamic and competitive economy that can thrive in the face of global challenges.
And it's about empowering citizens and businesses by making government more efficient, responsive, and accessible.
That leads us to our final thought for today. What role can we as individuals play in shaping a more efficient and less bureaucratic society?
Well, it's easy to feel like these bureaucratic systems are just too big and complicated for any one person to make a difference. But there are actually a lot of things individuals can do to help create a more efficient and less bureaucratic society.
Like what? What can we actually do?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is to be informed and engaged citizens. We need to understand how these systems work and how they impact our lives. That's the first step towards being able to advocate for change.
So basically, we need to do our homework.
Exactly. We can attend town hall meetings, contact our elected representatives, and participate in public consultations. When we speak up about our concerns and advocate for simpler systems, it can actually help shape policy.
So it's about making our voices heard.
It is. Another important thing we can do is to push for more transparency and accountability. We need to hold government agencies accountable for their performance, and we need to demand clear explanations for why things are done the way they are.
So we should be asking questions, challenging unnecessary complexity, and making sure there's a good reason for all the red tape.
Exactly. That helps create a culture of accountability and encourages continuous improvement.
Can we also do things in our own lives, both personally and professionally, to cut down on bureaucracy?
Absolutely. We can start by taking a close look at our own processes and procedures, whether it's at work, in our community organizations, or even just in our own homes. There are always ways to simplify things, streamline processes, and get rid of unnecessary steps.
So we can basically practice what we preach.
Exactly. It's about challenging the status quo and asking, why are we doing things this way?
Yeah.
And then advocating for more efficient and user-friendly solutions.
And I imagine technology can play a big role here, too.
Definitely. By embracing things like digital communication, document management, and task automation, we can reduce our reliance on paper-based processes and contribute to a more efficient digital ecosystem.
So if we can show others how much easier and more efficient things can be when we streamline and digitize processes, it might encourage them to do the same.
Right. It's about leading by example. And finally, we can choose to support businesses and organizations that prioritize efficiency and user-friendliness. When we spend our money with companies that value our time and effort, it sends a message that we want a less bureaucratic experience.
We can actually vote with our wallets.
You can. By making conscious choices, we can support businesses that are working to make things simpler and easier for everyone.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
It has.
We've learned so much about the economic impact of bureaucracy, the role that governments can play in reforming these systems, and even the actions we can take as individuals to contribute to a more efficient and less bureaucratic society.
And I think the main takeaway here is that while this is a complex and challenging issue, it's not hopeless.
By working together, governments, businesses, and individuals can create a better future, where administrative processes help us move forward instead of holding us back. That's all for our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us. We encourage you to keep learning about this topic and to keep the conversation going about how we can create a more efficient and user-friendly world for everyone.